Before studying the new emerging typologies in 19th century European architecture, it is important to note the causes and historical events that led to these new typologies. The first industrial revolution occurred in England and then spread throughout Europe, beginning in 1740 and lasting until about 1850. England was the first nation to experience the Industrial Revolution, and these ideas developed there and eventually spread to the rest of Europe. During the Industrial Revolution, the use of steel and iron as structural materials began to be more commonly seen. In addition, new energy sources were used, such as coal, steam engines, electricity, petroleum, and the combustion engine. These new energy sources led to new modes of transportation, such as trains, locomotives, steamships, and automobiles. These new inventions and discoveries led to the creation and reinterpretation of several typologies, such as railway stations, libraries, opera houses, as well as the creation of the Crystal Palace in London, England.
Hello, this is Key Reinhardt, and I will be presenting on the Biblioteca Sainte Genevieve. This is located in Paris, France, and it was built and designed by Henry Labrouste. It was built in 1851, and it is a very important piece of architecture, as well as a symbol of the high technology and the monumentality of buildings that this time period was able to develop. So during this time period, there began to be a splurge in railways and iron-roofed rail stations. So they kind of fell into the same category of this library. They both had a lot of iron detail and high ceilings, very monumental. So looking at this example, this is the Paddington Station by Brunel and Wyatt. This is a prime example of some of the buildings that were being built during this time. They had a significant role of steel being used within the buildings, and it gave this monumentality to the space, how you're able to look to the ceiling and there's glass, and the iron this development of iron allowed them to do that. They were able to span these large distances. And then, like the Biblioteca, as well in this example, they're using iron for a design element in detail. They're exposing it, they're making it known, and they're embracing it. And personally, I think it's a really beautiful design feature and advancement. So not only was Henry Labrouste the designer of the Biblioteca Sainte Genevieve, but he was as well the designer and architect for this building, the Biblioteca Nationale by Henry Labrouste, built in 1838 to 1850. And one thing that's so important and interesting about his work specifically is that this was the first time and place that libraries were their own building. Usually they were connected to palaces or other public areas, and so this was its own freestanding building, and Le Corbusier considered this to be the first building into the step of modern architecture. And at first, the name Henry Labrouste may not become recognizable. You may not know his name right away, but he is one of the most influential uses and kind of railways for the modern architecture movement, because of his use of new technologies like the cast iron, the gas lighting. He emphasizes it, and he makes it so beautiful and stunning that he's just so well known for it. As I have been mentioning, there has been a new production of steel during this time of the 18th century. This, along with the development of the new styles and just work in general, this new production gave way to factories and warehouses, railway terminals, administrative centers, hospitals, and many other buildings were just needed and expanded and developed with this new development. During this time, there was the huge precedent of this time was the Crystal Palace, designed by Joseph Paxton. We'll hear a little bit more about this later, but essentially it's another structure that was built to actually be able to be unassembled, and its use of iron and glass was just a gateway and a leading path for many buildings to come. Overall, I believe that Henry Labrosse does a great job of setting the precedent for this time period. He really shows the design order that is within this time period, the use of iron, and showing it off as a design element. I believe that he also accurately uses past architectural language and mixes it beautifully with the current, kind of in the direction of modernism. I believe that throughout all of his design projects, this one specifically and the other library that we looked at earlier, they're captivating, they're monumental, and they really, really just establish the precedents for years to come and reflect well on this time period.
Another emerging typology at this time was the opera. The architect Charles Garnier was selected to design the Paris Opera, also known as the Palace Garnier. This building established the style of the opera as the Napoleon III style. The Paris Opera was constructed between 1860 and 1875, which was during the reign of Napoleon III, which is also known as the Second Empire. During his reign, Napoleon III began the project of reconstructing Paris with the aid of Baron Haussmann, who worked almost as an urban planner to Napoleon. Haussmann worked to modernize the city of Paris and created broad avenues and boulevards. The Paris designed by Haussmann is very much the Paris portrayed by Impressionist painters like Pissarro and Caillebotte. The Paris we see today is still very much the Paris designed by Haussmann. The opera was to be constructed on 12,000 square meters of land and would house the Paris Opera as well as the Paris Ballet Company. Charles Garnier won the design competition in 1861. At the time, Garnier was a 32-year-old, relatively unknown architect. However, this building marked him as an innovative and revolutionary architect. The design of the Paris Opera combines elements of the Renaissance, the Baroque, and of Palladianism. Looking at the main facade, the influence of the Renaissance can be seen through the symmetry of the facade, as well as from Greco-Roman elements like the Corinthian columns and the Roman arches on the facade. In addition, the plan is perfectly symmetrical, which also points to the influence of the Renaissance. Next, the influence of the Baroque can be seen in the ornate and elaborateness of the building and its decor. Finally, the influence of Andrea Palladio can be seen in the large central dome as well as in the colossal columns located on the front facade. It is also important to note the main structure of the Paris Opera was from primarily iron framework, which reflects the innovations of the 18th and early 19th century. This can especially be seen in the cross-section with the ribbing of the central dome. Garnier was innovative in the sense that he combined the architecture of the past with new structural inventions such as iron. Upon entering the opera, the lobbies and foyers were the most ornate designs of the entire building. Here, Garnier made a statement about the importance of the social life of the bourgeoisie, that is, the upper class. These areas feature an enormous and grand staircase, chandeliers, large columns, ceiling frescoes, and ornate marble carvings. In the auditorium, the large copper dome that now has turned green on the facade acts as a false dome, and a second dome is placed inside. The area between these two domes is where the grand chandelier would be retracted and stored during the performances. The auditorium is very opulent and shows more about the upper class in France at this time. The boxes of the theater around the auditorium each give a unique and different view or angle of the stage. This speaks to the individual experience of the bourgeoisie class. Each box even had its own doorway and entrance, and the boxes were walled off from each other. This shows the importance of view in the design of the opera. It is also interesting to observe how artists at this time were portraying the Paris Opera House. Edgar Degas was most well known for painting ballet classes that happened behind the stage in the more informal area, although he occasionally painted the front of the house, including the stage and the dancers. Mary Cassatt primarily painted the bourgeoisie who attended the performance, and her paintings often depict the individual experiences described earlier.
Structures that resulted from the Industrial Revolution was the Crystal Palace. Designed by Sir Joseph Paxton, an architect who specialized in greenhouse and botanical design, the Crystal Palace displayed the speed and ease of building with manufactured cast iron. This gargantuan structure stretched across the landscape of Hyde Park, London, for over 1,800 feet and took up an area of over 1 million square feet. Sir Paxton submitted his design to the committee that was in charge of the building design for the First World Exposition, where it beat its 200 competitors. The Crystal Palace was inspired by first millennia Roman and Christian basilicas. Its main axis was composed of 5 core naves, which met the transept with barrel-vaulted arches. The palace was also based upon the more modern typology of the greenhouse, with its metal framework and prolific use of glass panels. This framework accommodated hundreds of individual prefabricated glass pane modules, which accelerated the construction process to a mere 4 months. The interior of the Crystal Palace matched the modulated exterior, with cast and wrought iron columns laid out on a grid. This design allowed for an open interior that created a series of arcades. The design for the palace for the World Exposition was complemented by the recent invention of photography, as you can see here. This is one of the first images that was taken of the Crystal Palace. Documentation of the Crystal Palace is profuse because of photography's introduction to the world through the World Exposition, especially since it gained rapturous support from England's monarchy. During its 140-day event, brought in more than 6 million people from around the world and radically changed the construction, architecture, and urban planning industries. Playwright Douglas Jerrold commented on this architectural marvel of the 19th century, saying that the Crystal Palace could be considered the first building to clearly unveil the characteristics of the new architecture. We could say that at the same time, it celebrates the centenary of modern architecture. The Crystal Palace was moved to Sydenham Hill in London, following the colossal success of the World Exposition, where it remained until 1936. It became the hub of social events and historical museums throughout the decades. Fortunately, it was destroyed by fire on November 30th, 1936, which is believed to be the result of an accident. Its high maintenance costs and lack of adequate funding left the building in a state of deterioration where it was more susceptible to damage. Attempts to rebuild London's architectural masterpiece were snuffed, especially since it would have been a major target during World War II by German bombers. Of Paxton's Crystal Palace displayed to the world for the first time the power and ease of modular construction. Additionally, it showed the grandeur and scale that architecture of the industrial era could achieve. Its use of glass facades and paneled construction set forth a new type of architecture that endures to the present day.
Next up, we have London's King's Cross Station, designed by the architect Lewis Cubbott and finished in 1852. When the Great Northern Railway reached London in 1850, the city commissioned Lewis Cubbott to design a new station to accommodate the new infrastructure, the result of which we now know as King's Cross Station. Cubbott's large experience with using cast iron to span long distances, including a railway bridge over the River Nene at Peterborough, allowed him to apply this same technology to London's new station, thus furthering the reach of the Industrial Revolution and its highly advanced construction techniques. The design of the station is relatively simple. It is 800 feet long and primarily constructed of reinforced heavy masonry, following in line with the traditional construction styles of the surrounding city. However, the width of the terminals, at 105 feet each, meant that they cannot be spanned with previous technologies without placing columns in the middle of the spans, which would have posed an issue for the tracks that necessarily needed to pass through. Thus, Cubbott employed incredibly strong and light cast iron ribs to effortlessly span the distances. Glass panes were inserted between the ribs to complete the enclosure. At their max, these barrel vaults are 75 feet tall, towering above the trains and the passengers below. They are additionally expressed on the front facade and provide a stark contrast with the masonry construction of the rest of the building. The only real ornamentation to be found on the facade is the 112-foot clock tower placed between the two vaults, which can be clearly seen in this image here. Entering the 21st century, the rapid increase in the station's user base required the city to expand the facility. Opened in 2012 and designed by John McAslan and Partners, the station's new Western Concourse takes the revolutionary construction techniques of the original station and abstracts them, resulting in a gorgeous soaring canopy that increases the station's footprint by nearly 90,000 square feet. King's Cross Station serves as another example of the revolutionary construction technologies that were being developed at the time of the Industrial Revolution. In particular, the use of cast iron to span distances never before thought possible. It is a masterclass in form following function, with the primary structural vaults creating an incredibly airy and bright space, providing a new and clean image to the railway industry. Additionally, it is an example of a successful synthesis between contemporary and classic architecture. Thank you very much.
The architecture of Europe in the 19th century reflects the innovations of the Industrial Revolution, as well as providing insight to life in the 1800s. The growth of industry and new technologies led to the creation of new typologies, as well as a redefinition of already existing typologies.